Today on the show, we're going to tell you a lot, hopefully, about a group of people that you may have never heard of or may have heard of by a different name than they prefer. So the name that you probably know is Gypsies. That is not a name that is preferred by most of the people known as the Roma, the Romani people. We're going to tell you their story, where they come from, where they live, what kinds of specific difficulties as an ethnic minority they face. But before we do that, we're going to tell you one particularly heartrending story as a way to get into this conversation. It's a story that has been covered extensively by our guest, Caitlin Dickerson, national immigration reporter for the New York Times and analyst at CNN. She covered the story of Constantin Mutu, the youngest child to be separated at the border, the southern border of the U.S., from his parents. This happened in 2018. He was 4 months old. Caitlin Dickerson, welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me.
Maybe we should begin with the story of Constantin's parents, Vasily and Florentina Mutu. They were from Romania. What was their plan? What were they doing as they approached the southern border? What did they think was going to happen?
Vasily and Florentina Mutu both grew up in a village called Râmnicu Vâlcea, or rather a village outside of a city called Râmnicu Vâlcea, in central Romania. Like you said, they're both Roma, which means that they were not able to get access to a quality education, only had a few years of schooling each, and have never had access to good jobs in the formal economy. And they'd also been exposed their entire lives to really overt experiences of racism, whether it was being harassed in the streets and being yelled at. Occasionally for Vasily, that even meant being roughed up in the streets sometimes, having their children be harassed in school. And then most disturbingly, after Florentina gave birth to their fifth child, Constantin, she says that the doctor who delivered her baby by C-section also performed a tubal ligation without her knowledge. She signed some forms when she says she was in the days of labor, but also she can't read or write and didn't know what the form said, she says. And after they found out that Florentina had been sterilized and they were devastated because they'd planned to have more children, which is traditional in the Roma culture, they finally decided to change their lives and to move to the United States. They'd known a few other Roma people, including Florentina's brother, who'd gone to the United States to seek asylum. And so they hoped to do that too. And the only way that they could do it, the only way they could afford to, was to get to Mexico with their two youngest children, Constantin and his brother, Nicolas, who was 4 at the time, and try to get into the United States to get asylum status or at least get into immigration proceedings, and then try to send for their older 3 children while they were hopefully working.
So as they're approaching the border, and I might urge people to actually read Caitlin Dickerson's story about this because it covers the logistics of it very well, but basically through a series of bad decisions and complicated misunderstandings, getting off the bus, getting back on the bus. Somehow or other, husband and wife wind up in different places. Husband winds up holding the 4-month-old child and winds up in contact with U.S. border officials. And maybe you can pick up the story there.
Yeah, so it was very difficult for them to make their ways through Mexico, right? Because they don't speak Spanish, they don't speak English. They speak Romanian. And so they'd been on a bus together and had gotten off. It was a crowded bus, so crowded that they weren't even able to sit next to each other, had gotten off the bus to try to get some medicine for Constantin and actually lost each other, where Vasily and Constantin, they'd been sitting separately, got back onto the bus, settled in thinking that Florentina and Nicolas were there too, but they weren't. It was terrible because when Vasily realized that they'd been separated, he also realized that his phone was out of international minutes because they'd been calling their 3 older children in Romania since they arrived in Mexico to check in, make sure everyone was okay. But those calls were very expensive, and so neither he or Florentina had any international minutes left on their cell phones. So Vasily thought the best next move would be to go to the United States border. He had his passport and and Constantin's passport and both of their birth certificates. And he decided to proceed with the plan to go and let American officials know that they were seeking asylum. And he thought that he would be able to tell them that he'd lost his wife and they would let him use the phone to try to contact Florentina somehow. But instead, what ended up happening, because, and of course, at the time, Vasily had no idea, was that this was right as zero tolerance was ramping up when they arrived. Before it had been announced publicly, but during a time where family separations were very much well underway. And so instead of being, helped and being given a phone to be able to try to contact his wife somehow, he and the baby were actually separated from one another. And Vasily was shackled and put into detention.
Right. And so then the father, everybody kind of winds up on kind of parallel tracks. The mother is still south of the border. The father is in detention. The child is eventually placed with a foster family. There are aspects to this, Caitlin, that they really do seem almost out of Orwell or Kafka. There's at one point a sense that because the father is inconsolable, and constantly sad about the fact that his 4-month-old baby has been ripped from his grasp and taken to God knows where. He's emotional and crying all the time. They decide he has a psychiatric disorder and needs at least evaluation.
That's what Vasily says, and we requested his medical records from the government. We received some, but the vast majority of what we've requested, we still don't have. But he was sent for medical evaluation many times, and doctors in records that I've seen noted that he was deeply depressed and confused. An important thing to remember is that during his time in detention, and Vasily remained detained for 4 months in American custody, he was not provided a translator. So he had his child taken away. He wasn't clear where Constantin was. And he also couldn't talk to anybody when he would ask for help, when he would ask for what was going to happen with his case, when he would ask where his child was. Nobody would answer his questions because they couldn't understand him. And he cried so much that his cellmates decided to just beat him up because they were so frustrated and annoyed that he was crying all the time and making such a scene.
So meanwhile, young Constantin winds up with a foster family on a tree-lined street in a nice house somewhere in Michigan, I believe. And does Constantin ever know anything about that? I mean, while he's in custody, does he have any idea where his son is?
Vasily does eventually learn that Constantin is with a foster family in Michigan. That's in large part thanks to Constantin's caseworker, Alma, who was assigned to take over his case. Constantin was placed into the care of a federal contracting agency that has a contract to house children, and in particular vulnerable children. It's called Bethany Christian Services. And so whereas many of the separated children ended up in these massive shelters, Bethany really prefers, when they can, to put children in foster homes, and they tend to deal with kids who are younger and more vulnerable. And each child who is placed into one of their foster homes is assigned a caseworker whose job is to liaise with the child's family to try to figure out a plan for the child's release. So she eventually did get in touch with both of Constantin's parents. But you can imagine, between the language barrier and just the fear about what had happened, I think it was difficult for them to actually trust that people who said that they were on the Mutu side were in fact on the Mutu side. It was confusing at times who worked for the American government and who didn't, who was responsible for taking Constantin away and who wasn't. And so even though they had a general sense of where he was, it was still an incredibly nerve-wracking and also, of course, just sad time because they missed their son.
Yeah, I said Orwell and Kafka. It almost seems like The Handmaid's Tale, too, this taking away of a child and really not really providing very much reliable information about where the child is and what's happening. So how long are Vasily, the father, and Constantin, the son, kept separate? How long does that separation go for?
So Constantin is kept in Michigan for 5 months. Vasily is released from federal custody after 4 months. He's told that he's going to get his child back when he leaves the detention facility, and instead he's put onto a plane without Constantin. Again, he's inconsolable and he's sent home. And after Vasily returned home, it was another month before Constantin was actually allowed to leave the United States because he was put in his own separate immigration proceedings when he arrived here. And those proceedings had to conclude before the baby was released.
I mean, I think we have to assume, Caitlin Dickerson, that all of the children who are forcibly separated from their parents at the southern border are going to bear the scars of this trauma and the consequences of this trauma for most of their lives, if not all of their lives. This particular age introduces a whole new set of variables. A 4-month-old child, we'd have to ask Piaget or somebody how much that child knows and can retain about the first 4 months of life. And then the next 5 months of life probably make a different kind of stamp on the child's consciousness. So I'm assuming by the time that Constantin gets out of Michigan and gets back to Romania where his parents are a distant memory.
Yes, from everything that we know. And you're right, you can't get inside the head of a 4-month-old or a 9-month-old. But what we do know is that by the time Constantin returned home, he'd spent the majority of his life in American federal custody in this foster home. And he was very traumatized by that second separation because he was starting to develop attachments from what we know and from what his foster family has said. So he developed, strong bonds with his foster parents. And it was very difficult for him to be separated from them. We think it was physical, there were difficulties in him having to, and this happened twice, live in a different place, learn to digest different foods, adjust to a different time zone, but also just being used to someone's voice, being used to their touch, being used to their demeanor and their family dynamics. He had a really difficult time. I mean, when my story published, Constantin was almost 2 years old. He still wasn't able to walk or talk at all, which was very different from the experiences of the rest of his siblings. He was very fussy still having stomach problems, and just struggling to adjust back to life in Romania.
Right. And I think, there are other parts to this, including the fact that, one of the things your story mentions is noise. He was in a rather quiet environment through those 5 months that he was in this house in Michigan. A Romani family in Romania is just a noisier place. That was a difficult adjustment. And let's face it, he was going from what we enjoy here in this country, which is a certain level of affluence and comfort, back to the poverty that's so dire that in the first place, it occasioned a very, very drastic decision by these parents to try to get into the United States with 2 of their 5 children. So, he's going from some comfort probably to some pretty significant discomfort.
Absolutely. And that was really difficult for Constantin's mother, Florentina. As you can imagine, she suffered very significantly throughout this entire process and still has a long way to go in recovering emotionally. But one of the things that she would talk to me about was this complicated mix of feelings where she felt so grateful for the foster family that cared for her baby. She felt so grateful for the caseworker who did the same, who allowed her to do FaceTime calls with him and, who took pictures for her so that she could see him as he grew and developed, started to make different noises. They would record those for her so that she could feel, at least in some small way, like she was still part of his life. And yet, when Constantin returned to Romania, he came with, like you say, many of these modern Western luxuries, new clothes, toys, diapers, a stroller, pacifiers, all these things that, she knows that she and her husband would not be able to afford to provide for Constantin, at least at the same level of quality as he had in the United States. And that was really difficult. She experienced overwhelmingly feeling that she was glad to have their family back together, that there was really no other option. And of course, she would have done anything to get Constantin back. There was also this smaller sense of guilt that she experienced from taking him out of this more affluent environment where he had more resources available to him and bringing him back, like you said, to the circumstances that they had fled in the first place.
So you have this family upon whom has been visited so much stress. We'd be here all day trying to count it all up. You've got the stress that the mother has gone through by having a child separated entirely from her and having her husband separated from her, but in a different place. You've got the husband who's been shackled in prison, occasionally physically tormented by other inmates while he goes through the terrible grief of not even really quite understanding what's happened to his child. Then you've had this child who is kind of yo-yoed through a whole series of different existences for 4 months in Romania, 5 months in Michigan, now back to Romania. It's almost uncountable. We could even add the caseworker that you mentioned, Alma, who I think actually eventually quit, kind of broken from watching this whole process unfold. And, I don't know, we talk in this country about reparations sometimes. You feel as though maybe the U.S. government needs to at least look at what happened here, and if not, try to make it up to the Mutu family back in Romania, at least begin to try to understand what's happening, because this process is repeating itself in different colorations probably throughout this whole period of high activity at the border. What do we know about what the federal government learned or did about any of this?
There's an ongoing federal lawsuit. So there are two ways, I should say, that this could be addressed. One is this ongoing federal lawsuit out of the Southern District of California. This is the lawsuit that prompted all of the family separation cases, those families to be reunified nationwide. That case is still ongoing, and part of what the ACLU, which is the lead plaintiff in the lawsuit, or rather who's representing the lead plaintiff in the lawsuit, is fighting for, is to try to get the government to offer some sort of support, whether it's mental health support, whether it's any other kind of assistance, something to try to acknowledge and address the damage, which, as you said, will be very long-term, if not permanent. The second option is that some families, including the Mutus, have begun to file civil claims against the United States government for damages, for the emotional harm that they suffered. Those cases, because of the way that the Torts Act operates and limitations in terms of trying to actually sue the federal government, it's not a very easy process. Those claims have to be filed, and one has been filed on behalf of the Mutus. There's a 6-month waiting period during which the government has the opportunity to respond in a formal way, to offer to settle, for example. If the government doesn't offer to settle or respond in a way that is satisfactory, then at that point the case can move forward. It'll take a long time. It'll be a really complicated process. It's an uphill battle, but that's really the only other option for recourse that these families have. And so we're still waiting to see the way that these cases are resolved, including the case of the Mutus, and that will give us an idea of whether families will receive any kind of assistance for what they went through.
So the story that we're telling, and in the subsequent segments, we're going to tell you a lot more about who the Roma are. But Caitlin Dickerson, one thing that we do know is that in Europe, they've often been a persecuted minority, frequently terribly persecuted. Even the story that you told at the beginning about the non-consensual tubal ligation of the mother is not an unfamiliar story to the Roma. This is one of the kind of social engineering policies that's been carried out against them by governments. So I guess like a lot of people showing up at the southern border, they're seeking political asylum, which my sense is that maybe in years past they had a better chance of getting. Maybe you can give us a sense of how this picture has altered for them.
Asylum in general is becoming a much more difficult status to obtain because of all the changes, both in policy and practice, that the Trump administration has instituted. But one of the reasons why I was glad to be able to tell the story of the Mutus is because in many ways they're a sort of classic asylum case, and that they do face very clear persecution by their government, by the public, in a way that has put them in harm's way. The type of person that the asylum laws, if you can meet the standards that are put in place, the kind of case that asylum laws are intended to protect. So it is possible that the Mutus could have obtained asylum status. I think they actually had a reasonably strong case for asylum compared to many others who try. And there is a precedent in a history of Roma people being able to obtain asylum status in the U.S. I think the main reason why those numbers are so low is that it's just very difficult for people to get to the United States from Europe, and they're more likely to try to seek safety, seek shelter or refuge elsewhere. But it is possible, especially based on experiences that have put them in physical danger and that have happened repeatedly and are likely to happen again. Those are all pieces of evidence that would, I think, based on my experience, not being a lawyer, could be compelling to an immigration judge.
We're going to have to stop it there, but Caitlin Dickerson, national immigration reporter for the New York Times and analyst at CNN, thank you so much for telling us this very sad story.
You're welcome.
And when we come back, we're going to tell you more about this group of people who are difficult to document, too. They probably are Europe's largest ethnic minority, but because of their circumstances, it's sometimes difficult to know even how many of them live in a given place. So much more to come after this break. Okay, we're going to move off a little bit from the case of Constantin Mutu and his family and talk more about the Roma at large, about who they are and what other kinds of persecutions they have suffered. To help us do that, and ideally also to help us celebrate them as well. Joining us now is Magna Matake, a Roma rights activist from Romania, director of the Roma program at Harvard FXB Center for Health and Human Rights, and co-author of Realizing Roma Rights. Welcome to this conversation.
Good afternoon, Colin, and thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Maybe something that we have done inadequately so far is explain exactly who the Roma people are. So give us just a quick sense of who this minority actually is.
Sure, I'm happy to. And then if you allow me, I would like to make a few points regarding the case that Caitlin was talking about as well. But to start with us, we are a ethnic minority group. We don't have a country or a land that we claim as our own, but we do have a population of about 14, 15 million Roma living across the world. Most Roma live in Europe, about 10 to 12 million. There is about 1 million Roma living in the U.S., but also there are Roma in the Middle East and Latin America. Apparently, our origins are traced back to the territories of India centuries ago, and several theories say that the migration of Roma happened on several waves. These theories differ in many ways, but some of them saying that Roma left during 11th or 12th century from the Punjab region. Other theories say that Roma left as one single group in the 10th century. Nevertheless, I think that in the absence of concrete historical evidence, what we can say is that around 1,000, a large group of Roma reached the Byzantine Empire, what is today Greece and Turkey, and this population continue to exist on the territories of various continents today.
All right, so we'll come back to that a little bit, too, and a little bit more of that history. But, yeah, you said you did want to respond to the Constantin Mutu case. Tell us what it is you'd like to say.
Yes, first of all, I do want to thank to Caitlin and the Weekly for speaking up against this outrage that has affected so many children from Central America and beyond, but also to thank them for being willing to listen to this story of a Romani family beyond prejudice and beyond bias, which I've seen in many reports drafted by researchers, academics, and also by journalists. So it is a practice of seeing bias in reporting on Roma, and I'm happy that there is a lot of humanity and there is a lot of thoughtfulness in the way that this article has been written. We know that there is a small number of Roma that is migrating from Eastern Europe to the U.S. But yet what we've seen in the past few years at the Harvard FXB Center's Roma program is that we receive a growing volume of requests for expert advice from representatives of Romani asylum-seeking families. And the central element of these asylum claims that are advanced by Romani families is racism, violence, discrimination, and stigmatization in Europe, including bullying and violence and segregation in the school environment. It's true that segregation is a phenomenon all across Europe, but it's also true that violence, including hate crimes, are a reality in Europe today, and they are on the rise. Some of you may have heard about this case in 2017 when three sisters from Italy were burned alive. There is another case of a 13-year-old Romani girl, Ianula, who was shot to death in Greece in 2018. A 23-year-old Ukrainian Romani man who was again killed a few years ago. So, this list can continue on and on. What I'm saying is that in the past decade, we did document hate crimes and anti-Romani violence in Hungary, Ukraine, Italy, Bulgaria, France, and perhaps the most recent examples are the cruel anti-Romani mobs in Italy and France in 2019. But again, going back to the asylum seekers, and I'll stop with this, our Roma program at Harvard has seen that along with forced removal from parents, as we've seen in the case, in Mutu's case, some Romani child migrants have also difficulty securing competent representation to establish immigration status in the U.S. Some lawyers, for instance, often of Romanian origins, and as they speak the same language with some of these Romani asylum seekers, hold really strong anti-Romani prejudice from back home, and they fail to represent Romani children properly. Also, in several cases, we've seen girls from traditional Romani families that have been detained in the U.S., and then they were forced to cut off their hair, only to face community shaming after deportation back to Romania.
So
there are various.
So, Magda Mataka, I just want to break in here and make sure we get to all this stuff and we don't run out of time here. First of all, it does seem that in Europe, some of this prejudice runs very, very high. I was looking at some European Commission research on anti-Roma attitudes. First of all, they do seem to run very high in Italy, where Matteo Salvini, the leader of the far-right party there, even used an Italian word for dirty gypsies, I think in a tweet or maybe in a comment, to characterize a Roma woman there. And it does seem that as we're seeing this international kind of surge of nativism, that Roma people are on the losing end of that.
That is true. And on one hand, we do have prejudice. You're right that in Hungary, in Italy, according to Pew Research Center, about 80% of Italians have unfavorable opinions about Roma. But it's not just about interpersonal racism. We talk about in institutional racism as well. And I think that the intentions of Salvini, Matteo Salvini, are very clear when it comes to Roma. He does want to create a separate census for Roma in view of deporting them from Italy. And it's not the only case of institutional racism. We've seen that across Europe. I mentioned segregation in education. That's a fact in so many schools in countries of the European Union and beyond. We also talk about internalized racism, and we would see, many Roma thinking less about themselves because this is what the literature, this is what the media, this is what the TV told them, that they are inferior to the Roma, to the non-Roma. So what we see is this racecraft, if you want to, I'm allowed to use Barbara Field's terminology, this idea that somehow justify racism. These ideas are there in Europe, and Europeans continue to think that we are part of an inferior culture. We are part of a culture of criminality, and these sort of ideologies of racism do help Europeans to justify their anti-Romani policies, anti-Romani violence, anti-Romani measures.
Yeah, so I looked at one piece of research that showed, I think the question was, would you be completely uncomfortable having a Romani coworker? And the numbers were much higher for that group of people than two other very vulnerable populations in Europe, trans persons and Muslims. The number of Europeans who said they would be completely uncomfortable in a work environment with a Romani person was considerably higher than even those two other groups. So, one thing we have to say a little bit more about is the history of all this. You talked about various theories of the time of the Roma migration, but one thing that we certainly see starting in the 14th century are Roma people being listed as property. They, as they moved into other parts of Europe, pretty quickly became slaves, sometimes slaves to monks, who you wouldn't think of as maybe having slaves. So this is maybe an untold part of the Roma story, at least for Americans. Maybe you can say a little bit more about the 500-year history of slavery.
Of course. So what I want to say first is that by the 1100s, if you want, Eastern European historical documents do make references about this new group of immigrants who worked as skilled metal craftsmen, musicians, and soldiers. And some Eastern European countries initially saw the Romani people as useful new residents. So Romani scholars, as Nicolae Gheorghe, would really make a connection between the history of slavery on the territory of Romania and the economic gain of the country from that time. But the slavery is really one of the most dramatic form of institutionalized oppression of Roma on the territories of Romania. As you mentioned, from the early 1300s, different axes of power really mixed together to enforce these repressive anti-Romani state measures through the institution of slavery. And it is this racist ideology that I was talking about, the racist ideology of inferiority that complemented this economic self-interest of Romanian Orthodox Church, of Romanian state, but also of the nobles, to promote a system where tyrannical power really yield huge economic gains to slave owners in both Wallachia and Moldova for about 500 years of slavery. As I mentioned, the state, the church, the boyars or the nobility, they all own slaves for 500 years. And it was not until the 19th century, basically in 1855, 1856, when the slavery ended. But it didn't. The abolition didn't happen with reparations. It didn't happen through a recognition of this catastrophe, and it didn't provide land to the former slaves. So if you want, the slavery continued in a more uninstitutionalized way for many years. Even today, we are still struggling to have a recognition of the Roma slavery in Romania. There is no apologies from the state institutions or from the representatives of the Orthodox Church, and not to mention recognition in museums, in history books, in the country. So there is not an acknowledgement, if you want, of this atrocity that marked so many Romani people. Me myself, I'm a descendant of slaves, and every time I go back to my village now, after I've learned that my ancestors were slaves in the area where I actually grew up, I cannot, help but thinking about the children who were raped, the children who were sold on the territories of my childhood.
I think people listening are going to spot a fairly obvious parallel here. A group of people who were typically enslaved, a group of people who in modernity struggled to get the same education that would put them on a par, on an even playing field with a racial or ethnic majority group, a group of people who are often mischaracterized as criminals or deviants of some kind. There's a way in which the trajectory of African Americans in this country there's also a G word that closely parallels the N word in this country. There's a way in which that arc of African Americans and Roma people are very, very similar.
Yes, I agree with you, and I think that in the case of the G word, in the absence of strong advocacy voices, we do see that the the term gypsy persists, and more so in the U.S., where alongside with citizens, we also see that media or public figures, they also use this derogatory word to define Roma. If you check, for instance, Jason Momoa's Instagram called Pride of Gypsies, but also their website, you will see that they define gypsy as a nomadic or free-spirited person and describe themselves as a tribe of artists and filmmakers. There is so much to unpack there, but the main idea is that they don't see us as a people. We are not seen as a people by Americans, and many other definitions of the word gypsies describe us as a traditionally nomad people, but also the expression to be gypped that is used so often in the U.S. is deeply rooted in the word gypsy, and it is a pejorative expression meaning to cheat, right, and to defraud. So the word gypsy is really deeply rooted in the racist idea of Romani criminality, from Cher's gypsy tramps and thieves to Shakira's I Might Steal Your Clothes.
All right. We're going to pause there. Thank you so much to Magda Matake, Roma rights activist from Romania, director of the Roma program at Harvard FXB Center for Health and Human Rights, and co-author of Realizing Roma Rights. The end of that conversation is a perfect bridge to our final segment, that whole question of Roma identity and indeed of the G word. All right, we're back. We're doing the final segment here of this show that we've been doing about the Roma people, or Romani people. And joining us now to complete our conversations is Cristiana Grigore, a research scholar and founder of the Roma Peoples Project at Columbia University. She herself is a Roma. She's working on a book that explores how American culture helped her understand her Roma identity. Welcome to this conversation, Cristiana.
I'm happy to be here.
So, there's a nice bridge, I think, from Magda to you, because one of the things that you've written, The Gypsy in Me, explores this whole question of what we were calling the G word in the previous segment. And, of course, the title of that is from a pretty well-known jazz standard by the Gershwins. There's a way in which, in America, that term, although it's obviously has all kinds of derogatory baggage, just the way Magda said, also has, some romantic baggage as well.
That's correct. And the exotic part of the Roma stereotypes at the first glance look like they're not harmful. Mm-hmm. And of course, there are differences between the criminal stereotypes about the Roma and the exotic stereotypes about the Roma. But they're harmful in their own ways, because when you see people as entertainers, as dancers, it's easy to objectify them, and it's easy to disregard their problems and dehumanize them. So you could, see them as something fun and exotic and spice up your life for a little bit, but you don't see them as colleagues, as classmates, as future wives or husbands. They don't have legitimate formal ways in which you look at it. And many times I meet people in the United States who, when I say I'm Roma, they don't know much, and then I tell them more, and I say oftentimes, but mistakenly called gypsy, and they say, "Oh, that's so exciting and that's so cool." And I know that in many cases it comes from a non-racist place, it comes from an ignorant place. So what I try to do in my work at Columbia University is to share with them about the Roma history and the history of slavery, because when they associate Roma with mobility and freedom, they project an image that I wish the Roma people enjoy these freedoms. But unfortunately, our history, it's oftentimes quite the opposite. And when they learn more about that, many of them actually become allies of the Roma culture because they are interested and intrigued about the gypsy culture and freedom and music and dance. But then when they learn about the real Roma culture, they become interested. And I'm always very happy when I see that transition to more awareness and more education.
So there's a racial term in America, passing. It's usually applied in the world of light-skinned African Americans would pass for white rather than declare who they actually were. And I sense that within the Roma culture, there's some of that too, that there's a reluctance maybe to declare who you are, what you are, the price you pay for being that particular ethnicity, particularly in certain European countries, is high enough that maybe you try to pretend you're something else?
That's correct. Passing, or sometimes called acting white, it's very common among Roma people. It was also my case. I didn't want to talk about my Roma identity for a very long time, and the reason why this happens is you play down your Roma identity because oftentimes it's the only way in which you can be seen as a respected citizen. You're not immediately associated with a criminal or a fortune teller or somebody who you need to watch your wallet when you're around them. There are many Roma people who are invisible, who are that's often the case in Romania. It also happens in the United States a lot. I work with some Roma communities in the US, and they keep a low profile, and oftentimes they internalize the stigma for generations and generations. And when I work with them and they see new ways in which they can relate to their identity, in my work at Columbia University, we present stories of Roma who come out of the closet. I know it's a term often associated with the gay people, but it applies to Roma as well. And it's a very difficult, challenging process of going from stigma and a secret identity to embracing who we are. That was definitely my case as well. And it might look like a choice. It's not. It's a surviving coping mechanism, because even in the case of, for example, my family back in Romania, even if we, everybody worked, everybody tried to do everything they could to be part of society, went to school. When I got the highest honors in first grade, my classmates' parents complained to my teacher and said, "How can you give these honors to a gypsy girl? That's unheard of." And of course, that affected me, and was the last time I had the highest honors. I was good, but not the best, because it was this trade-off between being socially included and being excelling, right? So, when I was in college, one of my boyfriend college at the time, I didn't have the chance to meet his mother, but she saw some of the photos of me. And although we never talked in our relationship about my Roma identity, it was completely secret. His mother said, "Watch out, she looks like a gypsy, and you want to be careful." So in my work at Columbia University, I try to give alternatives and encourage the Roma people to share their identity and go through this challenging but overall fulfilling process to share who they are. Because when you hide who you are, you don't really fulfill your potential, and also you have the chance to be a role model for other Roma, and to share with the world that we are more than the cliche, simple stereotypes we often see in media.
Right. We should say, that story about you in first grade is a very wrenching story to hear, but it's also a story of a Roma child in the school system. One of the things that I've learned in the research that we've been doing for this show is that Romani children are often kept out of school systems, that a high percentage of Roma children in Europe just simply don't get educations.
That's correct. I think many times you hear people saying Roma people don't want to send their children to school, but things are way more complex than that. And more often than not, what happens is the quality of education is very low, or the children are bullied, or the professors have biases against the Roma people. They already know they're not going to do well in school, or they're already like treating the Roma people in a different way, in a negative way. So the chances are not that great. There is absolutely a need for better education and more inclusion of Roma studies, Roma scholars, Roma students in mainstream academic universities, both in the United States, where very few people, I think, know that there is a large Roma population, as well as in Europe.
Right. I mean, just to reiterate one thing that came up with Magda too. I mean, obviously, the kinds of prices that you're describing right now that you and other Roma people would pay in the United States, just in terms of the psychic damage done by, very negative assumptions, very negative connotations, cutting things being said by people very close to you or close to people that you love. I mean, that's almost incalculable. But in some of the European countries, the price is even higher. I mean, increasingly as these waves of white nationalism spread across Europe to countries like France and Italy, it's flat out dangerous to be a Roma person.
That's correct. In my work, I sometimes work with Roma refugees that claim asylum, and their cases are heartbreaking. So much instability, lack of access to healthcare, housing. It's horrendous what I learn. And I believe that I also hear stories of communities that are inclusive, that are open to learn more. I visited such community in Pennsylvania a couple of years ago, are so important. And finding spaces that are safe and inclusive and have both in the academia and the larger society to understand what really happens, because it's easy to judge a people when you see, the first glance, but there's a history of oppression and discrimination for hundreds of years, and even the most fortunate of us who had the chance to have access to education and it was not our choice to pass, but it happened. We deal with so much painful things and struggles and challenges. I'm very grateful. My experience in the United States has been very positive from the first moment I came to US 13 years ago. And the openness to strangers that many Americans expressed, and welcoming, and the curiosity and the openness, it's so important. It transformed who I am personally. And later in my research and in my work, it provided a space for my work and my research to start a new conversation about what it means to be Roma, what it means to define who we are from inside out, not to have an identity imposed on us, not to have internalized forms of oppression where we suffer from shame and stigma, and we ourselves oftentimes don't see ourselves as fully human. So what we try to do at Columbia University, and with the support of many allies and many non-Roma friends that are very supportive and dedicated, is to create this space where we can question, what does it mean to be Roma in the 21st century? What does it mean to be part of a global people that we don't have a country, we don't have a territory, nor a narrative about returning to one. I think it's so fascinating. There are so many fascinating aspects about our culture that they're still to be explored, connect Roma studies or global studies. We are a people that are multicultural by definition. And I think there is so much potential, and there is so much already wonderful things that are happening. So I try to expose that and to spotlight that, because it's important. And it's important to see that things can change, and it's hard and it's difficult to deal with prejudices and to change mentalities. But I think it's possible.
Okay, we've ended in a perfect place then. On a note of hope, Cristiana Grigore, thank you so much for joining us from the Roma People's Project at Columbia University. Today's show was produced by our senior producer, Betsy Kaplan. Kylan Wolf, as usual, is on the board, making everything sound great and sweet. Tomorrow's show is about roadside attractions, and not the nice historic ones, but the garish things that loom up on the highway and make you think, should I pull over, or is that just too weird?